Thanks very much for having me here at Northernlands too. My name's Jeni Tennison. I'm Vice President and Chief Strategy Advisor at the Open Data Institute. And this session, we're going to focus on talk about the creation of standards and use of standards in an emergency situation like COVID-19. I come from a background of using standards. That was how I got into IT, into development, into software engineering, and into open data. So my involvement with W3C, with the World Wide Web Consortium, really was what put me on the path that I'm on at the moment. I love standards. Standards, I think, make the world go around. They make our lives so much simpler. But I've been questioning the degree to which standards are useful when you have to move fast. And that's the real question that I want to dig into today. So standards for data we define as documented, reusable agreements that make it easier to publish, access, and use data. So the crucial thing there is that standards are supposed to be there to make it easier to work with data. If you have a standard, then you don't have to think as hard as you would otherwise about how to exactly publish or use it. You don't have to go through the same thought processes that everybody else has gone through in working out what to do. And standards aren't just about, data formats and exactly what schema to use in a CSV file, for example. Standards can be things around identifiers. They can be what units or measures you use or what questions you ask. Standardizing things helps people to understand what you're talking about. We did a project a while ago on developing standards that really highlighted how many different ways standards can be useful. And if you go to standards.theodi.org, you'll see a set of guidance about that. Now, the thing about standards is that they do take time to build. And crucially, that's because it involves working with and negotiating with lots of other people who might have their own ideas about what should be in a standard or how a standard might be used. And it's that time-consuming nature of standards that makes them so difficult in an emergency situation. In April, we started a project on open data and COVID-19. And throughout this project, looking at the way in which data has been used through this emergency, we've noticed a real lack of standardization. Basically, everyone is doing their own thing. And that seems unsurprising because of the cost of that negotiation, the cost of actually developing a standard that slows things down. But we're wondering, is there a point when you should start to standardize data? Is it a case that there's more haste if you don't, but less speed overall? And so to dig into these questions a bit more, we're sharing today 2 interviews with people who've had to actually deal with health data during this crisis. First of all, I'm going to hand over to Olivier, who's our head of R&D at ODI, to interview developers behind Track Together, which is a symptom tracking app. And then following that, we'll have an interview with some of the NHS team about how they've been using data and the kinds of standards that have come through that. So first of all, over to Olivier.
Thank you, Jeni. So for this interview, I'm joined by Rashid Wahib and Guy Nakamura of the Track Together team. We've been working with the team at Track Together for a few months now. They contacted us when we started our project around the month of April, and we had a call for anyone needing help with data around COVID-19, and they were actually one of the first organizations joining us. Guy, you've been working on a symptom tracker app for a few months now, sharing some of this data collected through your app with academics. Was that always the goal?
Yeah, I'd say so. Rashid and I started Track Together about 3 months ago. So when COVID-19 was really first coming to public attention in the UK, We actually started with every intention of it being a quick weekend project. And this was ultimately because lockdown measures weren't in place. There was inadequate testing, and neither the government nor the public really had any idea what this virus meant and what we were facing. So in light of that lack of information, we built the first web version of Track Together, with the ultimate ambition of offering people better visibility of the disease in their communities, and with every intent to share this data with both academic institutions and public health authorities around the world. So,
thank you. Rash, so the collaboration that when we started our collaboration, it was around opening data, or at least it became about opening data. You've been now publishing anonymized open data from the data you've been collecting through the app. Now it's gone through several iterations. I was curious to hear from you, what would you say were the easiest and hardest facets of that work?
Yeah, so the hardest part was definitely setting up the entire pipeline from the raw data set to the open data set, and understanding some of the pitfalls in it, and understanding what can be shared and what can't be shared. So obviously the ODI helped us a lot there, understanding that at country level we can share data, but maybe not at postcode level, given that within a postcode and an age, having those two together, you could potentially identify a single person. That was one of the issues. Also, we started opening up the data quite late, so we hadn't set up the pipeline. We didn't value open data as much as we should have from the start, and had we known, we would have introduced this pipeline with our development pipeline. So one of the things that was quite easy in that going forward was using GitHub, and understanding, with the ODI's help, understanding that's the platform to go forward with. As an application engineer, very familiar with GitHub. And there was music to my ears being able to use it.
Thank you, Rashid. So the next step in the collaboration that we've had, and it was no longer just about you publishing data, but really starting a coordination with a number of other teams. There are quite a few symptom trackers, not just in the UK, but internationally. And your ambition seems to be to harmonize the work done with COVID-19 symptom tracking data. Guy, I'd like to hear from you. Where did this impetus to do that harmonization come from? And why did you decide to explore standardization and harmonization rather than, if I can, give a provocation, rather than merging all the apps into fewer apps or just one?
Yeah, of course. I think as we gained traction and the severity of the virus really started to come to light, we realized just how important the work we'd done was. We'd started to come across more and more similar initiatives, whether citizen, government, or company-led, and each and every one of them had very similar ambition to share this data with health authorities, academics, and other various parties. And these trackers were ultimately popping up everywhere, from Brazil to Vietnam to the UK and the US. And ultimately, while in the UK, collaboration was starting to take place through the government-led Project Oasis, which we are a part of, kind of led by the J-Hub and the NHSX, we always had a much broader goal and a more transparent, or should I say open goal, than that of Oasis, because that data is ultimately going to the government. And of course, we hope they put it to good use, but we thought there was a broader need for this, as we saw that the virus wasn't just affecting the UK or the US, it's a global pandemic. And I guess why standardization rather than the other approach of merging? I think there are a few reasons for this. One really was the speed at which we were all moving. I mean, of course, there's kind of initially a two-man project, but we are a much broader kind of volunteer team now. We were able to deliver really quickly, whereas governments obviously take time with due diligence and bureaucracy. So lots of manpower have been invested by various projects, and I think it would have been too tough an ask to really get them to merge into one. Secondly, I think there was a lot of value in the varied approaches taken by these trackers. For example, we placed a lot of emphasis on our social influencer campaign to grow our audience. And we naturally meant that would be hitting a different demographic to, say, COVID symptom study. And then thirdly, I guess, merging all of this into one app would raise a lot of questions about who owns the data, where is the data sitting, and how it's ultimately going to be used. So I think there's a huge benefit in having all these various actors in the space.
A quick follow-up question to you, Guy. If standards are important, why do you think that one hasn't quite emerged yet, or has one emerged yet that you're seeing that needs to get people around it?
No, nothing really, which is why we've ultimately come to the ODI for help on this. I think it's been very difficult because there have been so many unknowns in this. We've never faced this sort of situation previously. And as I said, there's so many different actors in the space. So we are just ultimately a volunteer organization, but then you've got governments and different third-party companies working on this. And I think ultimately we haven't had the time for that coordination. And as you've rightly pointed out, this does take time. And we've only been kind of months into the pandemic so far. So I'd say that is why there hasn't been one yet. But there is very much a huge need for it.
Great. So I'm going to follow up with a question to you, Rush, again in the same space about stewardship and organization, but more about the long term, because there is a case to be made perhaps about the fact that symptom tracking was only useful at the very beginning to try and understand the pandemic as it was unfolding. What would you say to someone thinking that symptom tracking is yesterday's news? And who do you think this data that you've been collecting is useful for in the long run?
So, what we found with the Track Together project was how the use of the data evolved over time and with different parties coming to play. With a single set of data, the use managed to evolve. Initially, it was a public application that people be able to see data within their area. So a lot of mapping happening. That later evolved when we had the J-Hub, NHS involved, and some universities. We were able to provide specific data for their research. And going forward, I think the applications are fairly endless. I think there are applications in business. I think we've seen emerging economies, particularly in education, which is one of my job. So in education, we've seen people move from schools to homes, and I think in the use of business intelligence, you can see how symptoms over time, how they changed, and how that affected children in schools, and how that shifted an economy. That's just one usage. But I think we'll see this data being used a lot for business intelligence, a lot merged with public health initiatives, a lot understanding demographics. So I think those are just some examples. I think that's just with this small data set. I think going forward, symptom tracking, with our standards, we get into play. So I think we get a framework together to fight any future pandemic, any future disease, any future effects of public health. And I think that's how it's evolved. So something so small, or something small, has evolved from pet project to researchers to potential commercial applications. So that's how data is useful in the long term.
Well, that's all we have time for, but this is a great way to finish on all the possible impact of this data if it's shared, and if it's shared more consistently. So I'm looking forward to working with you on that. Rashid, Guy from Track Together, many thanks for your time. Jeni, back to you.
Thanks, Olivier. Now, earlier in the week, I spoke to Indra Joshi, who's Director of AI at NHSX, and Ming Tang, National Director of Data and Analytics at NHS England and NHS Improvement, about their experience building the COVID-19 data platform within the NHS, and the wider work also within the NHS needing to wrangle data. I wanted to explore with them what they'd learnt in that process, and particularly about whether and how standards are useful in an emergency. So Indra, set the scene for us. What have you been building and why?
Hi Jenny, thanks for that question. So essentially, when the pandemic hit the UK, those of you who will know about how we approach data in the UK, we have multiple different data sets that are held in multiple different locations. And so one of the key things we wanted to do, and one of the fundamental key areas to actually ensure everybody understood the numbers and that the same number was interpreted in the same way. So what we did was we spoke to quite a number of people, both across government and across the NHS, and we said, look, can we actually bring some of these slightly disparate data sets together in a way that will then help some of the strategic decision makers, both in government and in regional teams, understand essentially what the numbers were. So what we did was create a database, for want of a better word, for different data sets across England primarily, so that operational teams could understand the core fundamentals, such as how many beds we had, how much oxygen, ventilators. So that's kind of in a summary what we've done.
And Ming, we often hear that NHS data is a bit of a mess. To what extent was standardization or lack of standardization a problem in the data that you were bringing together like this?
Thanks, Jenny. It was actually a big consideration. Some of the things that Indra just mentioned around counting beds and ventilators and all those things are strict counts, but we don't have electronic means to gather that information automatically. So we had to create data collections. Therefore, any data collection that you create, you have to make sure you've got a consistent way of counting things so that the people that are replying are actually counting them correctly. So we had to think about creating definitions, how we then use that information to make sure that we could compare apples with apples. Things that weren't physical equipment, they weren't counts, we also had to think about how do we de-identify the information, collect patient information, so data sets such as ICNARC. It's really important that we have that information because that gave us a wealth of experience of how the COVID treatment was going and what was happening to patients. So we had to be very careful, even with the COPI regulations, that we de-identified that, created a COVID-specific pseudonym so that we could link data sets together, but without, any of the privacy concerns, really. So we had to have quite a wide-ranging discussion with the IG colleagues to make sure we standardised how we de-identified data, how we then processed it, and then allowed linkages. All of that's really important. And yes, you're quite right, NHS data is usually quite messy. What we have learned is that the core reference data sets that we hold, like organisation codes, places like care homes, which you would think would be quite easy to have a registry. We didn't have one of those at the beginning of the pandemic. We now do. So we have had to create a lot of those registries, which has been fantastic. And then making sure that the consistency, not in just the definition of counts, but definition of, when testing results are happening, within 24 hours, within 48 hours, all those kind of clear definitions so that we can enable consistent analysis was really important as well. So that's kind of the things we were looking at, and I think we've learned a lot. I'm really proud of the pace at which we actually delivered some of the data and analysis as part of this experience, I guess.
And Indra, obviously the pandemic is an international phenomenon, but we're not seeing very much standardization about the way in which data about the pandemic is being published by different countries. Having been on the inside, what's your kind of insights? Why do you think that is?
I mean, I think this could go back to the kind of the wider issues with data collection. I mean, quite often, even inputting at source, I'm not going to go through the kind of usual problems that we have, but, EHRs aren't designed for us to actually input data in a way that is easy to do and standardized. And also, as Ming mentioned, there's quite a lot of different interpretations. So, for example, here in the UK, we call our ventilated beds O+, or V beds. Now, that's because we're here in England and we've kind of made that category, but it might not be the same in other countries. And obviously, there's a different language. So I think there's a huge amount of work still to do around data standardization. And we, for one, as Ming mentioned, we found it quite challenging as well, especially when bringing people from different backgrounds together. For example, data scientists working alongside clinicians, actually to understand those disparate data sets. There's quite a bit of effort going on internationally, such as communities like the Odyssey Network, which is looking at they call them common data models. So countries across the world can start categorizing in common data models. We as well are doing quite a lot of work around using open standards. So again, that we're kind of encouraging people to code in a much more unified language. And then I guess we all have a role to kind of drive this forward across multiple channels, both the clinical community, the research community, and as well, I would say the tech community has a big role to play.
Ming, one benefit of standards is that people get familiar with them and then they can use data that's using those standards really easily. But when we have a world where we're bringing together data from that isn't in those standards, and people can't make those same assumptions, what do you think the people who are producing this data need to do in order to mitigate the potential for misunderstanding?
I think it's really important that any data owner actually has very good metadata associated with that, and that those definitions and standards are actually published alongside the data so that it can be interpreted in a particular way. One of the things that we found during this pandemic was really using the data, particularly around modelling, and making sure that we had clear sets of assumptions that we were all using, and making sure we were transparent about those assumptions, both between the national teams, the regional teams and the local teams, because there is an opportunity to interpret this quite differently, even in how we count the number of O+ beds and what an O+ bed is. In different sites, they'll be classified as different things. So making that case, it's really important for the metadata and the definitions. And then for modelling, what we found was it created an even bigger need for collaboration. And to do that well, we have to have really good documentation, not just the codification of what we've modelled, but actually documentation around the clear assumptions, the objective of the model, the hierarchy of the models, their interdependencies, and really making sure that if we are using a particular data set, how that data set is refreshed, replaced during the period of which that you're looking at. All of this stuff is really important, because otherwise you can't actually compare and make best use of the analysis that comes out of it, because we were using a lot of our modelling to then drive our operational decision making. I think that's really important. We were able to make a case for lots of local decisions through better use of data that we were all tied together in the platform that we used.
And finally, Indra, are there any other places where you found standards being used within the health system to help respond to COVID-19?
Yeah, I mean, quite often when we talk about standards, the first thing that springs to mind are things like interoperability standard, data standards, and the kind of technical side. One thing we're very conscious about is there are a wealth of other standards out there, such as the regulations, and we here in the UK have something called accessibility standards and clinical safety standards, which I think are imperative when you're actually building either a device or a mobile app or a remote monitoring tool for whoever it might be. And the reason these things are really important to consider is, especially in speed and in haste, sometimes these things either get overlooked or there's suddenly a consideration right at the end of that development cycle, which fundamentally, when you're looking after people, and I speak as a clinician hat on now, is, human care. Don't do harm, do good. These are things that are fundamental that we as clinicians are trained to believe in. And sometimes when you kind of mix technology and clinical things, sometimes those thoughts are afterthoughts. And so one of the things we've done is we published what we call a digital health technology standard, which encompasses quite a lot of these things. So, going from clinical safety to cybersecurity, understanding privacy. So we've got the GDPR, for example, and also to consider if your product that you're building is a medical device, because as some people may know, the medical device regulations are changing here in Europe. And so we do have to be quite mindful about these things. So I always think it's important to to build these things in versus thinking about them at the end. And so this is why we've published some standards predominantly around the wider aspects versus just the more technical side, so people can consider these right from the start of that design process.
Thank you so much, Indra and Ming, for all of your insights. So having done those interviews and looked at the way that standards are being used across different parts of the system, it really strikes me that the process of standards that's useful is the one that involves engaging with the range of needs from different stakeholders, and the process of exposing and resolving different kinds of assumptions and differences that you have in order to get to data that is useful and comparable, so that you can bring it together, so that you can aggregate data from different sources, so that you can compare, for example, how different countries are doing. What we've seen is that right at the moment, aggregators are the standardizers. So, for example, with the Track Together app and symptom tracking, they talked about Project Oasis, a project that's being run by the NHS to bring together data from a number of different symptom trackers and to create basically a common way of viewing data from that range of different applications. Or if you look at the kind of data that is being published from countries about cases and deaths and testing and so forth, currently the way that most people are using that data is through the European Centre for Disease Prevention and Control activity that is bringing together 500 different data sets from different kinds of sources in a process that they don't actually give very much information about, in order to create those comparison graphs and so on. So those aggregators, the people that are doing all the processing of pulling together data, aggregating it together, are the people who are in effect creating standard ways of seeing data from, say, symptom trackers or about cases and deaths. And they're doing the work of the standards body, if you like. And really what we should be demanding from those aggregators is that they document the models that they're coming out with, which naturally will have some commonalities because they're pulling together data from lots of different sources, and open the code that they're using to map into those standards. If we do that, then at least we have a starting point for some standards that perhaps we could evolve a little bit more. Second thing that strikes me is that data publishers have been operating in quite a heads down way in terms of thinking about who is going to reuse data, but also what other people are doing, what other publishers might be doing. And some of that is justified. Indra talked about how different countries have very different ways of thinking about and structuring their information. But it would be a fairly low effort form of standardization if publishers just looked at what other publishers are doing and tried to copy it using the same headers in their CSV files, using the same kind of structures, for example, would give a kind of gradual convergence towards something that was a bit more coherent and that people could reuse without having to understand the depth and complexity of each individual publication. Again, documenting and publishing the models that publishers are using and the assumptions behind the figures that they're providing would give us a kind of leg up to something that was a bit more standard and a bit more coherent. But then the third thing that really strikes me is, what are we missing by not engaging in a proper standards process? We've seen a number of areas where publishers aren't providing data because they're not really thinking about who might reuse it outside their particular bubble, their particular people who are shouting loudest in their ears. right at the moment, we've got news about the way in which data published about testing in the UK hasn't revealed the full extent of cases in places like Leicester. And that's really a deficiency in the way in which data is being published, because people aren't listening to the needs of organisations outside of their particular bubble. The same was true around the publication or lack of publication around ethnicity data around COVID-19 cases and deaths. Having more people involved in the process and engaging more widely with potential reusers is one of the things you do when you're doing standards, but you don't have to be doing a standard in order to do that engagement. I do think that some of these gaps would have been highlighted and caught much earlier on if there'd have been a more inclusive process and a more thoughtful process about the way in which data is being gathered and published. So my kind of conclusion around standards development, as I say, I think that the process of standards development is the thing that gives its power, the way that involves different stakeholders. And if you can't do that, if you can't do the full standards process kind of rapidly in an emergency situation, you can at least talk to other people who might have an idea about how data could be used and reused. You can at least look at the way in which other people are publishing data, and aggregators and those who are going through the exercise of pulling together different kinds of sources can at least document what they've done, and perhaps provide some of that code as open source so that we can all benefit from it. But I'd love to hear from you. What do you think should have been done, and what could we do now in order to get better standardized data to help us deal with this emergency?